Hello, role-playing people, and this episode is a really quick follow-up to the lore of the Spirit, presenting the challenges and difficulties of either playing or running stories for characters who wield this lore. Let's get right into it. Probably the first thing to mention is that the very entities that are the target of these evocations aren't described at all in the core book. We are told these are human spirits, and that's it. If we don't have some Wraith the Oblivion books or the Storyteller's Companion for Demon the Fallen, we are given zero information on how to portray and run ghosts. What do ghosts want? How do they interact with the living? Can they materialize? What powers do they have? What behaviors do wraiths exhibit, and how would they respond to being interrogated or summoned by the Slayer? If the Slayer uses the second evocation successfully, which wraith replies first? The weaker, more inexperienced one, or the older, stronger one? How does a fallen know what to command of a ghost if they don't know what the spirit is capable of? And the very last question, how does a Slayer form an actual bond with a wraith? There are many questions to consider. Let's just start with the fact that regardless of whether we're playing into Wraith the Oblivion lore or the image of ghosts as everyone knows them, probably as seen in horror movies, these spirits are not happy. They are not at peace with themselves or the purgatory they reside in. We can think of them as whirlwinds of negative emotion, rage, fear, envy, hopelessness. So storytellers should consider how to portray these entities in a way that makes them feel scary, unpredictable, driven by emotion and the trauma of death. As a matter of fact, just imagine what it would be like to be commanded, summoned, and interrogated completely against your will by something that looks human but is much more than that. They call, you obey. You can't leave until they dismiss you, or if you push your will to the limit. Every time they ask a question, even should you try to deceive, the truth just pours out of you. You can't control it and you can't run. That's probably a horrifying experience, and it really makes sense with the High Torment version of both Speak with the Dead and Summon the Dead, right? High Torment Slayers are forceful, tyrannical, they don't care about these poor souls, so the encounter leaves the wraith feeling helpless and abused, scared out of its mind, or enraged, lashing out at everyone around, trying to make sure that thing which hurt it, which looked like an ordinary human being, isn't going to get close and do that again. So not only do the high torment effects make sense, but they can be great narrative tools, generating very nice story hooks. Example, neighborhood kindergarten becomes haunted seemingly overnight. Educators cannot explain or deny the potential danger the children are in. The building is closed down, at least temporarily, after multiple people suffer sudden and quite severe unexplained injuries. If this makes the news, unless the local Ministry of Dust has way bigger concerns, they should send at least one Slayer to investigate. And that can be the start of a beautiful story featuring a Halaku protagonist, a haunted kindergarten. Since I mentioned mortals being hurt by wraiths just earlier, what can these spirits actually do? Again, I'm going by the easily accessible pop culture ghosts here, using only the core book and general information, without going into the lore of Wraith the Oblivion and not even using the Storyteller's Companion. So even if these spirits can only do 3 things in your game, materialize, use telekinesis, and briefly possess people. These are already very powerful effects to call upon. And actually, we don't even need 3 of them. If the wraith can temporarily become material and use telekinesis, that's already great. But we don't have stats for these characters. So what do we do? How do we know what to roll for the ghost? Well, if we consider the third evocation, Command the Dead, I'm very much tempted to tie the player's successes on that roll to the ability of the ghost they are commanding. For instance, if a Slayer rolls 3 successes on a disarm attacker command. The Wraith automatically has 3 successes for that action. It's probably going to be resisted by a strength roll, as disarms usually are, but it's going to be very successful against characters with a strength of 1 and 2, since those automatically fail their resist roll, because they cannot even meet the ghost's 3 successes. Higher strength characters will need to roll and see if they can score 3 hits at a difficulty determined by the storyteller. If you play it this way and tie the Wraith's ability to execute a command to the player's own dice, you don't need to have prepared who knows how many character sheets for your Wraiths. But how can we justify this from the demon lore perspective? Remember how true names, when used properly, can rewrite a fallen's very nature and apocalyptic form features? This is something the Earthbound do a lot. Well, what if, when commanding a spirit, the Slayer temporarily overwrites the Wraith's very essence? That's an interesting perspective. Or maybe the Slayer empowers the souls of the dead in the same way a devil temporarily empowers mortals to perform certain tasks, using the second evocation of the Lore of Radiance. It makes sense to me, and I'd much rather have a simple go-to rule for this than to make sheets for all possible Wraith archetypes and their abilities, which would be a ridiculous amount of work. But this brings us to what I think is the core challenge of this lore. The fact that successful uses of Summon the Dead effectively require the storyteller to instantly bring 1 or more Wraith NPCs into the game. Rules as written, each success summons 1 ghost, which isn't always necessary, especially in instances when the Slayer really only needs 1 spirit. So I do believe the best way to handle this is to allow successes to decide on 2 things. The player can either convert each success into another soul that is being summoned, going for quantity, or each success adds to the summoned Wraith's age and experience, meaning stats, going for quality. This allows the player to steer the interaction in their intended direction. And also, if the player really only needs 1 summon, that's less NPCs the storyteller needs to come up with instantly, which can be very difficult, just coming up with NPCs on the spot. To put this into perspective, let's take a look at the first evocation of the Lore of Paths. Successes on that evocation dictate that nearby there is a path which meets the player's criteria. Right, that's not very challenging to narrate. Not only does the player tell you what path they are looking to find, but you don't need to roleplay a path. A path doesn't answer questions, it doesn't have a personality, a tragic backstory and death, and so on. Let's even take a look at summon monster type spells from Pathfinder. You are summoning a beast that is completely under your control for a certain duration, often a number of turns. You don't need to roleplay such a creature since it's probably not very intelligent or capable of speech. It doesn't need a backstory, doesn't need a personality, or even a name. And once the duration of the spell expires, it goes away like it was never there, no biggie. On the other hand, Summon the Dead urges the storyteller to bring forth a ghost, a human spirit, which can be conversed with and may or may not remember its life among the living, which has a personality. It looks a certain way, especially if ghost sight is employed. You can see what the wraith looks like. It's part of an underworld that can be described if asked to do so, and it is almost certainly driven primarily by emotion, probably negative emotion. This is very challenging for the storyteller because depending on where the use of the evocation takes place, the Slayer might summon very different archetypes of ghosts. For improv storytellers, this is less an issue since you can probably think Okay, we're in a school. What wraiths are around? Maybe a student who died as a result of bullying gone too far, or maybe a pupil somehow snapped their neck during PE class, showing off some pretty risky athletic moves. You can go even deeper. Maybe it's a historical figure from the history of the city, from a completely different age altogether, a powerful centuries-old wraith. And depending on that archetype, the improv storyteller comes up with some personality traits on the fly. This city guard from the 16th century is bitter but dutiful. He frequently haunts the museum where his coif is displayed. So then I can just portray this character starting from those traits and developing them as the interaction with the player continues, if it is in any way an extended or recurring interaction. If you are not an improv GM, and you have difficulty coming up with NPCs on the fly, then my suggestion is to have a list of potential wraiths depending on location. Obviously, graveyards bring together a lot of different types from very different professions. But what if the Slayer uses the evocation on a construction site, or backstage in a theater, or on a filthy street corner? It's good to have at least 2-3 potential wraiths with a few descriptors and cause of death on hand. So, on the street corner, you might have those who died as a result of gang violence, drugs, prostitution, or just a car accident. In a theater, you might have employees, actors, musicians, or whoever was there before the theater was even built. When I use the list, I usually have the spirit's full name, 2 descriptors, and cause of death. Example: Cornelia Sanders ended up homeless after her prolonged battle with drug addiction, and she died of an overdose somewhere on these streets. She trusts no one and is very deceptive. She can manipulate like no other. Bam. Repeat until you have a satisfactory number of potential NPCs. In making my wraith list, I can use a random name generator. I can have the very list in random roll format if the setting and the location allows for that, and if I want this lore to surprise even me, the storyteller. You can have, say, 19 archetypes, numbered 2 to 20, and you roll 2d10 to see who responds to the Slayer's summons. Doing it this way can be a lot of fun. Now, I did mention tying the stats to the player's roll and offered 2 solutions, 1 wraith per success and each success adding to the wraith's power. I like to think each success rolled on the second evocation, summon, adds 2 dots to the wraith's most important pools. So if the player rolls 3 successes and wants to summon only 1 wraith, the ghost's highest dice pool is going to be 6. Now this is tricky because the spirit cannot leave if they fail the willpower roll, and will answer truthfully, but unless commanded into obedience using the third evocation, it might try to harm its summoner. It might try to trick them somehow, especially if it's a powerful older spirit. Don't forget, wraiths can resist the third evocation with a successful willpower roll, and that can cause a lot of problems. So interactions with the dead should never be taken lightly and performed carelessly, because this can go a lot of ways, depending on how the player approaches the entire situation. If the interaction goes well, and I do believe low torment slayers would be very much inclined to help these poor spirits after involuntarily damning them to an eternity in purgatory, maybe the player character attempts to summon the same wraith again. As a house rule, I always allow slayers to go back to a location and simply resummon the same spirit they had already interacted with, but could a wraith simply follow the slayer home? Can wraiths easily travel through the Shadowlands? Well, this is where I guess it really depends on your setting, your take on the underworld. As presented in the Storyteller's Companion, the Low Umbra was ravaged by the Maelstrom, and the shroud separating the realms is weaker than ever, so a majority of wraiths have been either pushed into the Shadowlands from the deeper underworld, or they reside in between worlds in places where the shroud is torn, and they can easily access both the world of the living and swiftly retreat into the lands of the dead. This enables them to possess the living in the same way fallen do, which leads to the presence of entities called the Risen. Of course, you can integrate elements from Wraith or even Orpheus in your demon game, but I'm trying to simplify here. If I had to guess, I would say wraiths who aren't assisted or empowered by slayers can't really move around too much because the Tempest is the worst it's ever been. But slayers can bind wraiths to items, and this is where the fourth evocation becomes super useful in the context of the setting as presented in the Companion. If you establish a genuine connection with a wraith and try to keep them safe, you definitely need to bind them to an object you can control and keep out of harm's way, since you never know what sort of malevolent spirits lurk within the Tempest. Low torment uses of the fourth evocation don't hurt the spirit in any way. They actually offer a portable safe haven, and as long as the item is attuned, the wraith can interact with both its protector and the world. Overall, despite these difficulties, the lore of the spirit is fantastic, especially when the player understands the gravity of the scene and the nature of the spirits they are working with. At our table, we've had breathtaking scenes. The Slayer discovered a family of ghosts, a mother and two daughters who died in the War of 1812, and it was amazing to see how much the Slayer cared for these wraiths and wanted to protect them, and of course was assisted by them in exchange. As a last note, it really is a shame that the information included in the Storyteller's Companion in regards to ghosts and the lands of the dead, which is no longer than 6 pages by the way, wasn't included in the core book. It's a huge shame. I mean, those 6 pages could have made all the difference between the lore of Spirit being a slightly suboptimal but fantastic lore, a functional lore with a ton of accessible and enticing options, and it being as it is now in the core book alone, a fantastic lore with nothing but potential, and confusingly written systems to the point that it's barely playable. I'm happy they at least addressed this in the Storyteller's Companion, because it really is one of my favorite lores, and I really wish it had received more attention. Thank you very much for listening, take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.